So in this lecture, I'm going to look at what I call the taxonomy of the ethics of war. And that is just ways that we can think about war within ethical frameworks. And the frameworks are realism, militarism, pacifism, and just war. Now, picking up on our old hero Socrates, the thing that he always stressed at the beginning of inquiry was to define terms. And if you've ever been in various discussions, arguments, whatever you want to call them, normally people should, they don't, but they should start off by defining terms. Why? Because to make sure that you're talking about the same thing. Think about something like the abortion debate. When people talk about what it even means to have an abortion, and what it even means to have a human life, right? Because, for instance, some people say life begins at conception, and well, okay, in one sense it does, depending on what you mean by the term life. If you unpack that in terms of chemicals and molecules and all that stuff, you could probably tell a story like that. But if you unpack life in terms of when you say to someone, get a life, that's a very different meaning of that term life. And so when people start talking about life in that argument, in that discussion, often talking at cross purposes. Anyway, so the sort of the takeaway from that is the importance of definitions. And that's what Socrates was all about, right? So in many ways, philosophy and pretty well all kinds of scholarship, science, etc., starts by defining its terms. Well, let's look at a little bit, since we're talking about war and the ethics of war. Before we even talk about the ethics of war, let's think about what is war. Well, that raises the definition problem. What is a war? I mean, we use that term in all kinds of ways. We even talk about the war on poverty, right? We talk, and people talk about, well, I was involved in a war. We use that word in all kinds of ways. We call lots of things, a war on terrorism, a terrorist war, etc., etc. What exactly does that term mean, and how should we use it, and how should we even talk about making or constructing a definition? Remember, definitions, they don't just fall out of the sky, and definitions have consequences. So like I referred to in the abortion debate. So if you allow someone to set the terms of a debate, then you're often constrained by that, and the arguments will flow in a certain direction given the definitions that are put forward at the onset of the discussion. Now, one definition is that war is a sustained coordinated violence between political organizations. That is, shall we say, a fairly contemporary definition. Often you'll find that in the works of sociologists and lots of historians. They kind of go along that line. And in the literature, you'll find often people will talk about it in these kinds of terms, and also in history itself. But speaking of history, if we look at Clausewitz, who was a Prussian military officer, and he involved in the Napoleonic Wars, very experienced on the battlefield, lived at 1780 to 1831, so he was living during a very tumultuous time in Europe. He put forth a work, classic in war studies, called On War. Pretty difficult read, heavily influenced by the philosophers of his time. So you'll find all kinds of things about like Kant and Hegel and a lot of the German thinkers. We call him a Prussian, but he was born in a small town not far from Berlin. And he said that he had a number of interesting comments and analyses of what war was. He regarded it as sort of diplomacy by other means. That's a famous one. You'll hear that often. That comes from Clausewitz. He modeled war. He thought of war as a kind of duel, right? A duel between individuals. Only the individuals could be unpacked in terms of like a large set. So a large army would be like an individual and fighting another large army, sort of like on the model of a duel. And he basically expressed war as an act of force, or an implied or a threat of force. Then you've got to unpack what you mean by implications and implied threats, etc., etc. But nonetheless, he regarded war on the model of a duel as an act of force to compel the enemy to bend to our will. That's really what a war is. So again, if you wanted to go with that definition, you would have to start trying to unpack, what do you mean by force? Is it yelling? Is it violence? etc., etc. What do you mean by the enemy? How do you unpack that? And then, of course, bending to will. Then you got a very traditional metaphysical construction of what exactly is a will. So that's one avenue to go down. I'm just going to talk a little bit about this more contemporary one, just to illustrate some of the problems. So if we say that war is a sustained, coordinated violence between political organizations, we're in the game of, okay, what do you mean by sustained? You know, like you think about the 6-Day War. Is that long enough? That wasn't very long, but we called it a war. So 6 days, do wars have to last years? Could you have like a war over a weekend, or would you call that a skirmish, etc., etc.? Coordinated. What do you mean by coordinated, right? How much coordination? Can you talk about degrees of coordination? And is there official, unofficial coordination? You might not think this is a real problem, but it does become a problem when you talk about, breakouts in violence, riots, insurrections, terrorism, all that kind of stuff. The notion of what do you mean by coordinated plays a huge role. And as I said at the outset of the video, how you define your terms will affect the arguments you make about it. So defining war and how you conceptualize it, that's the big point. How you conceptualize war will have consequences. It will have an impact on how you even apply the ethical theories to war, how you even conceptualize the ethics of war. So there's two levels of conceptualizations. There's the preliminary of the quote-unquote object in and of itself, then the type of theory that you're applying to that conceptualized object. These things don't just read themselves off the world. Humans have to be involved and that, when we get involved, that involves interpretations. And one of the unique things about us is we not only interpret the world, but we interpret our interpretations. So war is what's going on is interpreted as war. That's a particular interpretation. And then how you apply the ethics to that, that's another kind of interpretation. So there's lots of room for discussion in our conceptualizations. But if you just say, wait a second, I'm not interested in all that stuff. I don't really want any parameters on this war. I'm just going to equate it to like a conflict or whatever. Well, if you do that, and if you say, well, war is inevitable. Why? Because it's conflict, and you're never going to get rid of conflict. So, you know what? War is just part and parcel of it. It's like the weather. It's always going to be there in some form or another. Well, that's okay if you want to do that. But again, the defining war in terms or equating it to conflict rather than regarding it as a particularized species of conflict. If you just throw open the doors and you don't put parameters on it, well, then all kinds of statements become, on the basis of your definition, pretty well true. You could say, well, forget it. War is inevitable because it's conflict and can't get around conflict. Humans will always conflict with each other. So the importance is to remember that definitions don't just drop out of the sky, and they have enormous consequences when you start thinking through things and the arguments you make and the ethics that you apply.